Yes. All right, give it up for these Australian dogs. That was incredible. That was amazing. I forgot to mention they were Australian. Maybe you already knew that. But whose first time was that ever seeing a Bluey episode? Yeah, wow, okay, quite a few. All right. Well, they're only 8 minutes, so you could really just burn through them. It's great. At least my kids love it. Margot told us in the pregame meeting that the third season has 48 episodes, so she knew off the top of her head exactly how many there are. My friend from seminary, my neighbor, she just wrote up a review of Bluey for Christianity Today. And she was wrestling with why does this resonate deeply with her faith? And she was saying there is something about those moments of reconciliation and connection and love and innocence that also deal real directly with very real things in life, like hurting your kids' feelings, or in other episodes, death or loss, or all kinds of things. Why does that invite us so powerfully to think about our faith? And her theory was, this is a little bit of what heaven will be like, where things are made right, where people are connected. And I love that invitation to take something, as everyday as a kid's cartoon and help that make the few steps to thinking about not just Jesus, but a transformed world. And that's what we're doing across the next couple of weeks here. But in this episode, you see, they get down into Bingo's world. It is told some from her perspective, but in the end, this is an episode about apologies. So let me put the cookies on the bottom shelf here. And with Eddie, I'm going to be doing this. This is my hand motion. So let's see how good we can do it. Yeah, I already said that part. This part, you are the chief apologizer. That's what this episode tells us, that in whatever environment, whatever team, or at your work, or in your family, it is your job more than it is anyone else's job as a follower of Jesus and as a maturing human being to be the person who is the chief apologizer. The apologies are yours to give. We're going to explore and unpack that. Along the way, we're going to learn from Harriet Lerner. She's a feminist psychologist who I love. She said this about an apology. A good apology is when we take clear and direct responsibility without hint of evasion, blaming, obfuscation, excuse making, and without bringing up the other person's crime sheet. So that's a good apology. And here we got to see Bandit give a great apology because he didn't say, I was on the phone, I told you to please leave me alone. We've talked about this before. He engaged in at least 8 minutes of getting on her level and thinking about things from her perspective and finally issuing this very heartfelt apology. I know I hurt your feelings, and that must feel pretty bad when your dad does that to you. He got on her level and he gave this kind of apology. This is from a great book called something like Why Won't You Apologize, which, of course, every spouse has already given to their spouse, so that's great. This is a great book. Harriet Lerner is amazing resource, written a ton of books, very useful. I like this one. Along the way, though, she notes a very real problem with apologies. It's this. Yes, nailed it. We're wired for defensiveness. It's quite natural, actually. So here you can have some self-compassion. If you're like, maybe I'm not so good at apologizing, or maybe I am well known to be defensive. It is quite natural. Our automatic set point is to listen defensively. What that means is that we're automatically listening for distortions, exaggerations, and inaccuracies. That's our natural mode, which means we have to choose to apologize. We have to grow into someone who is no longer like this and has become someone who can issue one of these quite transformative apologizers. And here's what you get when you're the chief apologizer. You get transformed relationships. See how transformative it was for these cartoon dogs to have this one apology? Every relationship in your life will benefit from a meaningful apology of this kind that we're talking about. If you are the chief apologizer, you are going to live with some transformed relationships. And one of the reasons that is, and what we're going to explore now, is this reality that apologies are important to God. Now, here in the book of Matthew, sort of a famous verse about this, when you're offering your gift at the altar, this is a reference to the quite ornate and complex animal sacrifice system in the ancient world. When you're there giving your animal sacrifice, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift right there before the altar and go, is what Jesus said. First, be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Now, in the Old Testament, there are quite famously 613 Old Testament laws. Over 20% of them are about how to offer your gift at the altar. And so if Jesus is saying, actually, 100 of these laws don't even apply to you right now until you go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, they are Extremely important if God is opting out of this thousands of year old tradition of relating to God this way. It is so much more important to God than anything else if we are being reconciled to our brothers or sisters. Now, here's a powerful image. In the Old Testament, there are two brothers, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob is a swindler. He has swindled his brother Esau. Decades later, they run across one another. And in the ancient world, when you traveled somewhere, it was with all your possessions. So imagine two really noble, wealthy guys walking through the wilderness, and they have trains of camels and flocks of sheep and all their tents and belongings behind them. And then Jacob gets the report that Esau's tribe is off in the distance, and he realizes, I swindled that guy. He probably wants to kill me and maybe take all of my stuff. So Jacob, still a bit of a swindler, does this. He himself went on ahead of his caravan of possessions and went by himself and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. This is a great image. Just like the cartoon dogs bowed down, they got down on Bingo's level so that she could understand and participate in the reconciliation. They entered her imaginative world where fairies were real. So Jacob bows down 7 times to reconcile with his brother. And what happens here is Esau says, oh my gosh, how have you been? Look at your family. Look how successful and wealthy you are. And they had this joyful reconnection because of this right here. Not that he didn't swindle his brother, he did, but he bowed low. There's sort of a famous scholar named Jack Miles who wrote this book in the early 2000s, God, a Biography. Now, Jack Miles is famous for being a Shakespearean literary scholar. And he brought all the tools of reading famous literature to writing God's biography. And one of the things he said along the way was, even though we can think of God as a kind of perfect being, he also was giving an incredible apology on the cross. That the cross represents God giving the kind of apology that Harriet Lerner was describing, taking full responsibility for whatever has happened. Jesus wasn't up there on the cross saying, you put me here, and you put me here, and you did this. He didn't bring up the other party's crime sheet. He took a vulnerable position to invite reconciliation, just the way Bingo did. And just the way Jacob did. Jesus took the vulnerable place so that we could be invited to reconcile with him. And above all else, this is our model. That Jesus took the vulnerable place with me so that I could take the vulnerable place with all kinds of other people in my life. And ultimately, that's what a good apology is, right? To not be defensive or guarded, to not be on the attack, but to take the vulnerable position to say, you were right. I was wrong. That's quite vulnerable, isn't it? And yet Jesus, our teacher, is teaching us to take the vulnerable place in our relationships. Harriet Lerner gives us a real helpful list, which I will email you tomorrow, of exactly what these look and feel like. 9 essential ingredients of a true apology. I worked for a long time on getting the font larger. Could not do it, but I will read them to you. 9 essential ingredients of a true apology does not include the word but. I'm sorry, but. Keeps the focus on your actions and not the other person's response. Includes an offer of reparation or restitution that fits the situation. In that episode, we saw the restitution being, we're going to play imaginary fairyland for 8 minutes. That was a good way of fixing the situation, of making amends. Number 4, it does not overdo. This is a subtle but very dangerous one of over-apologizing, right? It's appropriate to the wrong done. 5, doesn't get caught up in who's more to blame or who started it. That's a popular one for me. I know I was wrong, but you were a little bit more wrong, right? 6, requires that you do your best to avoid a repeat performance. 7, should not serve to silence, to end the conversation. I'm sorry, so please leave me alone now. 8, shouldn't be offered to make you feel better if it risks making the other person feel worse. Sometimes you don't get to offer an apology. Sometimes the other person actually never wants to see you again, and that is quite justified. And you don't get to force yourself on them to give an apology so that you get to do the right thing. Sometimes the right thing to do is to let them go their own way. It's interesting with Jacob and Esau, they didn't see each other for 30 years. It was exactly this. When the time was right, they reconciled. And sometimes as the offending party, we have to accept we must wait till the time is right. And sometimes we don't even ask the hurt party to do anything, not even forgive us. We are just acknowledging what happened. I think this is the true power of Bandit with bingo. He simply said, it must feel really awful when your dad does that to you. And if I could condense this into two sort of axioms of what is a good apology, you take the vulnerable stance and you center everything on the other person's true needs. See, sometimes I can apologize because it's what I needed, right? But the truth is, a good apology lets the other person have the spotlight. And this is where we are following the good teacher, our friend Jesus, who taught us to take the vulnerable position. And when I think about my own relationships, there are some where it is easy for me to get down and say, it was me, I did it, I was wrong. I hope we can reconcile. And there are some places where it is so hard. There are maybe decades of frustration or pain, or maybe there was a really big problem between me and another party, and it is much, much harder to take the vulnerable place. And so here, this is the secret sauce of what I think is at the heart of Dwell Church. See, there was an older gospel that is really quite profound, but I think incomplete. It went like this, that Jesus died for your and my personal sins so that one day we might go to heaven. And Jesus' death and resurrection are the most important things that ever happened in human history, but that was not the full scope of the gospel that Jesus was explaining. His big point was that God has come to be with us now. That his death and resurrection removed all the obstacles so that we could fully be in God's presence. He was announcing the arrival that God finally is fulfilling his promises and showing up in our lives in a new and quite powerful way. They called it the sending of the Holy Spirit to dwell within us. And what we get when we think about apologies or failures or character flaws is that we get an ever-present, all-knowing, quite generous teacher. You see, truly, if we wanted to, we could say, Jesus, will you teach me to give good apologies? Would you teach me to take the vulnerable place? I notice within myself this defensiveness, and Jesus, would you teach me a better way? This is the secret sauce to all of our lives, but also becoming a person mature enough, large enough, having generous enough spirit to give one of these apologies that is deeply vulnerable and centered on the other person. See, Jesus will take quite an active role in teaching you and I to do that. And so, as we conclude week 1 of Bluey, 2 bits of homework for you. Take a moment and say, Jesus, would you teach me to take the vulnerable position with others? And then maybe if you are brave enough, find someone to apologize to. As I was thinking about this, I reviewed all the apologies I've given that were adequate, all the ones that were inadequate, all the places where I could have apologized with all kinds of people. It was quite refreshing, actually, to remember, I got a lot on my account that I could be apologizing in this way for. And I was thinking about a 7th grader that I knew when I was at Menlo Mountain View. I'd been there for 18 months, and I made the big announcement that I was moving to the San Mateo campus. And I shared kind of in the programming, it was like on a Sunday afternoon, same time slot as this, and I asked all the middle schoolers, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, let's have a Pastor Matt ask me anything, AMA, you can ask me anything you want to. I just announced that I was leaving, and I really wanted them to feel like, they got to kind of understand why this was happening, and they were furious about it. The first question was, did you leave for more money? And I was like, okay, this is great. This is going to be great. So I explained, the San Mateo campus is about 10 times larger than this youth group, but my salary isn't 10 times larger. But yes, I will be making more money. And so they asked a lot of pointed questions, and then we got to share some good memories, and we got to give a lot of hugs. But there's one guy, I remember, 7th grader. And afterwards, I was like, hey, man, are you okay? And he was just kind of down. He was sitting on the curb outside the building. And I didn't know what he was going to say. And he looked up at me and said, how long have you been here? And I was like, not quite 2 years. And he said, 2 years, and you still don't know my name, do you? And he was right. I never knew if it was Ian or Ethan. And I was crushed. Imagine how awful that must feel. You're in 7th grade. That could be a hard season of life for some people. But then also, this is supposed to be a safe place with a lot of positivity. And here on this day, he was really finally having the guts to ask this question. And I had to say, hey, man, I'm sorry, I don't. And I know that must feel awful. But I've always thought you just seem like a great guy. And I feel sad that I didn't get to know you better, and I am so sorry for that. And I hope that was enough Because there's no way to go back and fix that stuff, is there? But for one moment, I tried to say, let it be about you. I could have said, well, there's like 100 kids here. I can't get everybody. I got 98 names today, man. But I tried to share with him for a moment because I knew that hurt. And that was just one moment, right? That's not a complicated relationship. He was a great kid. I was very obviously wrong. In all the other complexities of life, here it is for you and me, my friends, to ask Jesus for help. Let me pray for you. We'll be done. Jesus, thank you that you gave us a pathway to reconcile. Thank you that you took the vulnerable position with us so that we might be reconciled to you, that you loved us in that way. God, that in some small but powerful analogy that we get to watch these cartoon dogs get down on one another's level and say, I know it hurts, I'm right here. Thank you that you did that for us. So Jesus, would you anoint these people right here to go out into their world and be the chief apologizer? May they bless people by letting those other people be the center of things for a moment. Would you teach us, Lord, to take the vulnerable position with one another? Craft in us, Lord, a heart that can be soft towards the people in our lives. We love you, Jesus. Amen.